Okay, so how are we going with the series so far? I've heard quite a few conversations and people have come with questions and comments, and I've seen some evidence. People have shared some stories about changes that they're going to make with regards to the way that they handle or deal with or think about their money, which is wonderful. And I know that Josh and I have both found it very challenging and provoking as we think about our own attitudes in relationship to money as we've prepared for the series. So that's a good thing. Now, Josh brought you the first in the series, which was called Less is More. And do you remember, if you were here, he talked about how liberating it is. I've got it written down so I remember the words properly. How liberating it is to have just one hand full of tranquility rather than two hands full of toil. It makes sense. If it doesn't make full sense to you, go back and have a listen to the podcast. But the title was Less is More. So one hand of tranquility instead of two hands full of toil. And last week, the topic was stress, or financial stress particularly, is bad. And we looked at 3 prayers and 3 proverbs that we can use to help make changes today for a better tomorrow. Now, next week, I won't be here. I'll be speaking at Mosaic Church in South Perth. But Josh will be bringing the last in the series, which is called Tomorrow Matters. And that brings me right back to today, the third in the series, which is titled Giving is Good. Now, I said last week that I doubted anyone was going to have, an argument with me, or it wasn't going to be hard for me to convince people that financial stress is bad. And I think I could probably say the same this week, that most of us are going to be happy with the starting point that we're choosing, that, giving is good. Most of us would be happy to nod along with that, and certainly to nod along with these words made famous by a follower of Jesus called Paul centuries ago. He said, "And I have been a constant example." Don't you love his humility? It's a confidence, isn't it, actually? Because he was not proud, but he was confident in what he was doing. "And I have been a constant example of how you can help those in need by working hard. You should remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive." So I think most of us would, as I say, nod and agree and say those words are true. But, although we love the idea of giving, and although I'm sure many of us would say, yeah, you know what, when I have been in the practice of giving, there has actually been a blessing back to me. That wasn't my intent necessarily, but there was a blessing back to me. So we go, we get that. But we don't necessarily do it. It's like we've got this in-principle agreement that giving is good. And I think there's a number of reasons for the but. So we can agree that it is more blessed to give than receive, but I'm struggling with my own needs. It's not that I don't want to. It's not that I wouldn't. It's just I don't have enough for what I'm dealing with here, so that I can't think about giving. You might agree it's more blessed to give than receive, but you say, I have, if you're old enough, back in the day, seen too much TV evangelism, or I've lived long enough to hear too many bad messages that have tried to manipulate people into giving. Give $100 and God will return you 1,000, or give this and you'll have so much more than you could ever imagine. And, you feel a bit jaded or manipulated about the falseness of those promises. For some of us, we can agree it's more blessed to give than receive, but what I have is finite, and it needs to last my lifetime, which I'm hoping will be long. And I think that last point is a fairly common one for those of us who live in the part of the world where we clearly have enough. More than enough. I think that last one is probably one of the things that we struggle with quite a bit. What I have is finite. It needs to last a lifetime. I need to protect it. And I have to say that for me personally, of those 3 reasons, that's the one that's going to catch me out. I haven't been burned by TV evangelisms or evangelists, and my dad was the pastor when I was growing up. I didn't hear any financial manipulative sermons. And I know I have enough to give today. I have enough for my needs and enough to give today and more. But for me, the thing that will catch me out is but what about tomorrow? What about tomorrow? I'm not struggling to meet my daily needs, far from it. But how long will that last? How long will I last? How long is what I have or what I'm capable of making going to need to last me? And of course, can you see how that gets very tricky and circuitous in conversation, even inside your own head? For one thing, we don't know how long we're going to last in this world. And the second thing is, what actually is enough anyway? Have you noticed how elusive that is? Actually landing on what is enough? It shifts all the time, it seems. Very, very elusive. And so I get into that circle of thought, which I hope I'm not the only one that does that. Not that I'm wishing it upon you, but I'm guessing I'm not the only one that does that. And I say something like this, I know I have enough, but I'm not sure about tomorrow, so if I could get a little bit more, that would be better. And then think how generous I could be when I know that I have enough for that little bit more, and then I'm going to be awesomely generous in that space. And so I just need to get a little bit more, and then I'm going to be, you can see how it goes round and round and round in your head. It sounds very intelligent when I say it to myself in my own head, not so much when I say it out loud. And this is such a common phenomenon that it's actually been given a name. It's called having a scarcity mindset over against the opposite, abundance mindset. Which I have to say, it seems to me, is what Paul, who wrote that famous or quoted that famous, "It is more blessed to give than receive" passage, seems to have figured out. He seems to have learned how to rise above the common reasons that we are struggling with giving, and he's learnt to give and give and give and give. His life was shaped not by a scarcity mindset, but by an abundance mindset. It wasn't shaped by what he didn't have, what he doesn't have, and what he might not have. That's really important. So the way that he chose to live now wasn't shaped by, back then I didn't, right now I don't, tomorrow I can't be sure. It wasn't shaped by those things. Now, a little before that verse that I've already read you, Paul says these things. "And now I entrust you to God and the message of his grace, that is able to build you up and give you an inheritance with all those he has set apart for himself. I have never coveted anyone's silver or gold or fine clothes. You know that these hands of mine have worked to supply my own needs and even the needs of those who were with me." So we'll keep that passage up on the screen for a minute so you can follow this through. Paul wasn't a man who envied what others had, verse 33. I often think I'm not until I see something I haven't got and I want. Then I feel it. He was prepared to work hard for what he needed to live, but more than that, he worked extra bit hard so that other people had what they needed to live as well, verse 34. And then I think the reason for all this, is that he seemed to have learned to do this giving and giving and giving because he couldn't get away from the abundance of the inheritance that he had already in Jesus. That's up in verse 32. That's the starter to all of this. So it's like, oh my goodness, I've got this amazing inheritance. And it translated into the way that he gave and gave and gave. Now, I know when we read the whole story of Paul's life, it's very clear that it wasn't all one way. He wasn't this superhero constantly giving. A lot was given back to Paul, if you know the story of his life. It's worth reading it to have a look. He got love and affection and practical and financial support and friendship. And in fact, if you read a little further down in the passage, you'll see that there's a beautiful picture there of just how much love and support he has, because he tells the people that he's talking to that he might not see them again, and they cry, and they hug him, and they kiss him, and that's a pretty awesome gift to be given relationally, so that he's thought of that well. So I think Paul was a real-life example of the wisdom of Proverbs 11, verse 24 to 25. The world of the generous gets larger and larger. The world of the stingy gets smaller and smaller. The one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. Those who help others are helped. Now, we did a series on Proverbs a while ago, but in case you've forgotten or weren't here in that space, and I don't want to lead anyone astray here, we've got to remember that Proverbs are not cause and effect absolute promises. So this is not, they're gems of wisdom that are true in many circumstances. So this is not equivalent to if you give 100, you'll get 1,000. It's not equivalent to saying if you are generous, you'll have more than you need all the days of your life. It is saying that it's one of those general life truths that when you give, you will, first of all, be a blessing to others. And when you give, you will in turn be blessed. And the reason you'll be blessed, and why this I think is often true, even if it doesn't come back to you in money, the reason you will be blessed is that giving changes you. Giving broadens your horizons. It enlarges the world of the person you've given to, for sure, but it enlarges your world, our worlds as well. It loosens our anxious control. It enlarges our world. Just like it did for Paul. And that's some wisdom I reckon I could get used to. That's a poster-worthy truth. It would have been a poster-worthy truth back in my day. That's what we did as teenagers. Nowadays, you should hashtag that on social media. Giving changes you. Giving enlarges your world. That's something that's worth sharing, I reckon. Giving changes you. Giving enlarges your world. Okay, so hopefully we've got to this point in the sermon, and I hope you have heard that giving is good for others and for you, and hopefully you can agree with that. Can I get a few nods? Yeah, come on, smiles even, wonderful. And most of the nods don't look like you're doing it with gritted teeth, which is a beautiful thing. All right, you're right. Okay, so if that's so, if our world is enlarged in good ways when we give, and other people's worlds as well, then how can we get better at giving? And that's where I want to take us into to finish out today. How can we get better at giving? I've got 3 practical things that I think will help. The first is to trust God with the first things first. In other words, in the context of our finances, trust God with what we have gained, or some of what we have gained, as a first and basic offering. Now, if you've been in church for a while, you're saying to yourself, here comes the tithe. She's going to say tithe now, and actually I am, so there you go, congratulations, well done. But listen to the whole thing through. So tithe is an English word that comes from the Hebrew word ma'aseh, which means 1/10. And the practice behind this word started back in with the Old Testament Israelite people who would bring 1/10, a tithe, a ma'aseh, of their crop, their livestock, or however it was that they made a living. They would bring the first 1/10 of that as an offering into the temple. You can read about that in Leviticus 27. Then if you fast forward to the New Testament, the idea of the tithe is something that Jesus actually picks up on. In Matthew 23, he's having this really intense conversation with some legalistic and slightly aggressive leaders, and he's talking to them about the way they've turned faith into legalistic following of the law. And he says this: "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith." I'm going to take a drink before I tell you what Jesus said next. Screen, so you can't even tell.
I'd like to know what you do when you try to give someone something and they turn around in effect and say, "Shut it up, you're jumping."
You try the next person. And I mean, yeah, actually that fits a lot with what we've been talking about with the building a discipleship culture and finding a person of peace. I think sometimes we have that, but I must make this person take the gift, or I must help this person come to Jesus. If there's a wall there, move on to the next. Or come ask me, I'll always take it. Okay, so that little bit, and then Jesus goes on to say, you should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. So he's saying you should tithe, don't neglect some other things. Now, hang in there with me. I'm not going to take up the tithing debate today. My point for raising this today is not to debate with you about an amount that should be this first things first offering. It is to say, why I've raised it is to say that the very least that we can do, and the very first thing we can do, is trust God with a first things first offering. You should tithe, yes, said Jesus. There's more. He wasn't putting a full stop after that. There's more. You should tithe. Yes, said Jesus. There's more, but at least do that. And do that well in that space. So nowadays, I know some people will use 1/10 as a guide. Others have a much higher first things first offering. I know that for a fact even in this place. Others have less because of the circumstances they are in. The point that I'm trying to make here, and I think the practical thing here for us, is to trust God with an offering first up. To trust Him with the best that we can do first up every time. Decide what it is you are going to give and then give it every time first off. Just like most of us would not think we wouldn't pay the electricity bill. It's just a thing that we need to have. I don't want to make it quite as mundane as that, but you understand the principle behind that. Decide what you're going to give it every time first up. And if you can't decide what's right to give, well, just give something. I was talking to someone in the week about the fact that we have to move to be steered. You think of those big ships, a big ship can't be steered if it goes too slow, actually. Certainly can't be steered if it's anchored or tied up to the port. If you don't know what to give something, move, and you will find that you will be steered and guided in certain directions. Okay, so actively trusting God with a first things first offering is the first, I think, incredibly practical way of practicing that abundance mindset and enlarging your world. So choose what you will put aside and do it. The second thing is this. These next two are a little shorter to get through. Plan to be generous. Although I've got a story I want to tell you in this space. Plan to be generous. Now, I think that's kind of counterintuitive because we plan to get rid of debt or we plan to acquire. It doesn't mean we don't want to be generous, but we don't often think about generosity as something we plan for. Now, Josh and I have talked a little bit about this. In the first week, Josh talked about if you get an unexpected financial bonus, being prepared to think about how you might use that. And last week, I talked about the discipline of saying no now so you can say yes later. Both still really important practices. But this is something different again, this idea of planning to be generous. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament that talks about characteristics of good leaders and wise people. And one of the characteristics talked about is generosity. I don't have a slide for this, but it says, but generous people planned... Oh, I do have a slide for this. Oh, look at that. It was late last night. But generous people plan to do what is generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. So just as we plan to acquire house, car, holidays, savings, we can plan to be generous. And Craig Groeschel tells a story of a family actually from his church, still currently in his church, that who decided that on top of their tithe, they tithed to 10% of their offering. They were challenged by this idea of planning to be generous. So they decided to add a line to their budget, really, which was their planning to be generous line. And they started by putting $20 a month aside, actually. That's how it worked for them. And then they would ask God and look around and see how can we've got this money because we plan to be generous, how can it be used? They kept a journal, they keep a journal. The first month where they had just $20, there was a disaster, a cyclone or something in some part of their country, and they sent it towards the funds for rehoming people. The second month, they were in the queue at the supermarket and the lady in front of them didn't have enough to finish paying off what she'd purchased. So they paid for that, and that lady and her family ended up coming to church. They stuck up relationship with them. Other things they've done is they bought a uniform for a kid in their kids' soccer club, and you get the idea, that sort of thing. And that started years ago with this family, and now that same couple will give $200 a month above their tithe as part of their planning to be generous. What a practical way of establishing an abundance mindset and enlarging your world. A new line in your household budget, planning for generosity. And there's one more thing we can do to get better at giving, and that is simply to start now. It's a little bit like the ship, I guess I've already mentioned. Start to be generous now. Okay, getting a fair bit of the Bible here today. I won't read it to you, but I want to tell you about one more passage. There's a passage in a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth about the awkward topic of money. That they were trying to make a big collection of money that was needed to support them in their ministry and help people along the way. And there was a little bit of pushback from the people. What do you keep asking us for money? What do you need this money for? You know, there was that sort of conversation going on. And so he deals with some of that. And then the point that we get to, he frames it in the end in the bigger picture context of what it means to be people of God who follow Jesus. So the whole passage is 2 Corinthians 9, 6 to 15. You can read that later. He refers to 3 Old Testament scriptures in there, but it's the third one that I think is the kicker that I just want to read to you now. So 2 Corinthians 9:10, it's an echo of a passage from Isaiah. For God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. In the same way, he will provide and increase your resources and then produce a great harvest of generosity in you. Now, in a very short little space of time, I'm going to explain the significance of this. The important thing about Paul referencing Isaiah here is that reference comes slap bang in the middle of prophecy in Isaiah that there's going to be a new covenant, a new agreement, a new relationship. Then there's stuff about God providing, and then another prophecy saying it will be the servant of the Lord, it will be Jesus. So that puts this passage in a very particular context. There's a new way of us being in relationship with God, and it's going to be through Jesus. Paul was saying, hey, we've always known throughout our history that God provides for us, and now he's done something which it doesn't provide so that we just survive. It provides so that we and all humankind and all of creation can thrive. And it's happened because of Jesus Christ. It has to do with the resurrection of Jesus, who broke the cycle of evil and death to liberate us. To forgive my sins, yes, but to liberate us. Don't lose that part of the picture. To liberate us and all of creation from the things that bind us up and tie us up and keep us in our small and anxious and unenlarged worlds. Paul urges the people he is writing to, and I believe through them, he urges us all these years later, to see their place, to see our place in the great unfolding drama of God's provision for his creation, and to embrace generosity starting now. For the church at Corinth, it was that collection. They were holding back. They didn't want to hand over any more money into that collection. It's not that for us here today, but it will be something. The principle is the same. Being generous now in response to the good and generous gift of freedom won for us by Jesus. Start now, because that's what followers of Jesus are. We're givers. Giving is not what followers of Jesus do. Followers of Jesus are givers. In the same way as we saw these men and women serving, we've got people out in kids' church, people serving in sort of ways, all sorts of ways. It's not because that's what followers of Jesus do, but because followers of Jesus can't help but be servants and gracious and generous givers. So I want to say to you, I want to remind you of that proverb. The world of the generous gets larger and larger. And then down to the next line, the one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. So if you follow Jesus today, if you're sitting here and you say, yeah, I follow Jesus, 3 things. You might do all 3 of these already. Trust God with a basic first things first offering. Choose what you will give, put it aside, and give it. Check in on it every now and again as your circumstances change, up or down. But do it. Choose what you will give. Do it. The second one is plan to be generous. You might have other ways that you're already doing that, but if you don't, maybe a new line in your budget. Or, maybe, my daughter does this, our eldest daughter, grab a jar and it can just sit somewhere on the kitchen bench, maybe not in front of a window so it's enticing. And hers isn't labelled this, it's labelled something else. But, you could label it your planning to be generous jar and get everyone in the household to give in. Maybe if the kids get pocket money, a little bit out of that can go in, as well as out of your own pays and that sort of thing. So, get everyone to pitch in and then get in the habit of saying, so where can we see God might want us to be generous this week? Who do we know? Here's some of the stories from your kids or your friends or others in your family. So trust God with the basic first things first offering, plan to be generous, and start now. Don't be tied up to the jetty, because I bet you'll be tied up to the jetty in a month, a year, 10 years. Start now. So what's an opportunity before you right now? Is this your local church? Is this the church you call home for now? And the first question is, do you give here? Do you give to support what's happening in and through this place? Is there a project or a need that you can see? Start now. And hey, if you're sitting here this morning and you don't follow Jesus, but you like the sound of him, and you like the sound of the lifestyle that his followers are trying to live, the generous lifestyle that his followers are trying to live, then I really want to encourage you to have a conversation with me or with Josh or someone you've seen up the front here this morning. We'll get them working straight away, shall we? Or someone that you trust in this place. If you think that interests me, I'd like to know more about that. Trust God with the first things first. Plan to be generous and start now. I know many of you are doing at least some of that. Many of you are doing all of that. I hope you feel challenged and encouraged that the world of the generous will get larger and larger, and the one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. Shall we pray together as the band comes back? Father, if there are any of us sitting here today listening to this from that mindset of, oh, hey, no, this is for followers, I'm not a follower of Jesus, but it sounds a little interesting, then we want to, on those people's behalf, invite your Holy Spirit to keep sticking with them in that space. And if that's you, we encourage you to say something to someone. Take a step today from wherever you are in relation to Jesus, perhaps a little closer to him. And you know, even if you don't declare yourself a follower of Jesus, there's some beautiful principles here to practice, and you're welcome to join those of us who do declare him as Lord. And I'm going to pray a prayer for all of us, borrowing Paul's words from Philemon. He starts by saying, I always thank my God when I pray for you, Philemon. I want to say, I always thank my God when I pray for you, LBC. Others as well, because we keep hearing about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all of God's people. And I am praying that we will put into action the generosity that comes from our faith as we understand and experience all the good things we have in Jesus Christ. The love that comes out of this place gives so much joy and comfort to many. The kindness that comes from the people in this place has often refreshed the hearts of God's people and the hearts of those who don't yet call him Father. May God's love, Jesus' action of liberating us, and the power of the Spirit help us to give so that the world of others and our own worlds are enlarged.